Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're jumping in with part 2 of our level 4 spells tier list, and I'm recording this directly after finishing part 1, so I haven't yet seen any comments or feedback that you've left for me on part 1. If there's changes that I want to make as a result of the feedback that I get, then I will be covering that in a future video. But of course I do appreciate everyone's feedback, and as always, if there's anything that you think needs to be changed about these lists, leave a comment because I do take those into account, and we have made a lot of adjustments based on community feedback in the past. Let's jump right in and talk about freedom of movement. I think freedom of movement is one of the more underrated spells in the game. It's one I often see dismissed out of hand because it takes an action and it's a defensive spell, and people typically don't like defensive spells. How freedom of movement works is on cast, it removes a stun from an ally, so any stunning effect from a stunning strike or a mind flayer effect. Most often a mind flayer stun is going to be how your party gets stunned. And then it lasts until long rest without concentration, giving the targeted character a number of buffs. These buffs are difficult terrain can't affect them, so they're completely immune to difficult terrain, including your own entangles and spike growths and so on. And they can't be paralyzed or restrained, so it makes you completely immune to two of the more dangerous crowd controlling effects in the game, which enemies actually do apply pretty frequently. Paralyzed and restrained are both conditions that you're going to see targeting your characters pretty often, and so immunity to those is really not bad. First up, there's the use of this as a camp buff. You can cast this from a camp follower for free, and because it's a day-long buff that doesn't require concentration, you can get it on your entire party at the cost of nothing, because it's a camp follower who's casting it. As usual for these spells, I'm going to be considering its use as a spell actively cast by your party that's costing you resources, rather than a spell cast by a camp follower, because obviously anything that you get for free is going to be worth taking, but we're going to consider whether it's worth actually preparing and casting for your characters. And the answer, I think, is actually often yes. Unlike a lot of those other day-long buffs, freedom of movement has a very important in-combat role, which is as a panic button when your character gets stunned. It's action neutral in this case, or actually very slightly action positive, because it takes your action, but you get back the action of the stunned character if they're acting later in the initiative. If a character gets stunned in a bad situation, they can be in a lot of trouble because stunned is such a debilitating condition. Or if an important character who you really want to have active for the next turn gets stunned, you can break them out of it with freedom of movement. And the fact that it then gives you a bunch of pretty relevant buffs for the rest of the adventuring day, so it's not just like you're using this just to break out of one crowd control effect, does, I think, give this spell more use than you might otherwise think for a purely defensive spell. Do I recommend casting this at the beginning of the day? No, I don't think so. I think that it's not worth spending your level 4 spell slot to have freedom of movement, maybe in like a difficult terrain focused party, of which I think you could build one. Maybe that's an idea for a future video. You could cast this on a character who's not immune to difficult terrain and make it easier for them to get through. Another thing is that it is worth mentioning that it does not stop them from being affected by ice surfaces or electric, like surface effects. It's difficult terrain only. But so entangle and spike growth count, but ice surfaces you will still go prone on. So don't expect that freedom of movement will break you out of your own ice surfaces. This is not worth casting for the resources of your party at the beginning of the day, but as a prepared spell slot to have as a panic button, because there are so many enemies that stun during in Baldur's Gate. We face a lot of stunning enemies, and because if you have to use it as an emergency panic button, it still gives you a pretty relevant bonus for the rest of the day. I would say this is a B-tier spell. I think you are overall pretty encouraged to have this prepared, even if you don't use it most days or most combats. I think it is a very relevant spell that is worth taking, especially because as a level 4 spell, you can see it's often not competing against spells that are particularly strong, because level 4 spells are a valuable resource to actually cast, but a less valuable resource to learn and prepare, since fewer of them are powerful and relevant than previous levels of spells. So you can get away with taking slightly more situational spells when you're learning level 4 spells, and I think that Freedom of Movement really does justify its slot. Cast this, like I said, if your character gets stunned and you want to break them out of the stun. Otherwise, don't cast it at the beginning of the day, but still quite good to have in your back pocket for a situation where you need it. Next up, Grasping Vine. Grasping Vine is a summon spell, which are often pretty good, but this one, I'll be honest, this spell makes me mad. Because basically everything that they have done, could possibly have done to make this spell weaker, they've done. It's a concentration-based summon that creates a Grasping Vine, which has an attack that pulls an enemy to it. On paper, that sounds pretty cool, actually, because you could place it inside a hazardous effect and repeatedly pull enemies back over a wall of fire, or into an ice surface, or into a spike growth or plant growth or something, causing enemies to consistently have to try to escape the surface. However, this spell takes your concentration, and the vine that it summons has 5 hit points. Why does it have 5 hit points and 10 AC? Why does it have 5 hit points as a level 4 spell? Especially because it's a gigantic vine, so it really does not look like something that should have 5 hit points and 10 AC. Even if the AI doesn't target it, and it will because the AI likes to take free attacks that kill stuff, it is such low, the hit points on this are so low that any stray AoE effect will kill it instantly, and then you've spent your level 4 spell slot for nothing. So while the tactical possibilities of this spell are cool, the fact that it requires your concentration and the fact that it will almost never work because the dang thing will just die every single time you cast it means that this spell is just not worth casting and preparing. I really wish that they had done something different with this spell. In tabletop, they can't target the vine, meaning that it is much more interesting because it doesn't create a summon, but the way that they've structured spells like Grasping Vine and Spiritual Weapon in Baldur's Gate really works against this spell, especially because they decided on the worst possible numbers for this spell, and it's a concentration spell, unlike just about every other summon. D-tier spell, I do not recommend casting this. I really wish this one were better because it does exactly all the things that I want spells to do. You know, be cool, have a bunch of weird tactical effects that you could use to feel awesome and clever, but the numbers on this spell just don't work out, and the cost is way too high to make it good. Greater Invisibility. Greater Invisibility is, well, it's invisibility, but better. It is a 10-turn concentration effect that you can cast on yourself or an ally, and it turns you invisible. However, unlike Invisibility, the level 2 spell, your attacking or casting or doing anything does not break the invisibility effect guaranteed. Instead, when you attack from Greater Invisibility, you make a stealth check, and the stealth check gets increasingly difficult each time you attack or cast a spell or whatever from Invisibility. The tooltip, because this is Baldur's Gate, doesn't tell you how difficult the spell check is, or the stealth check is, or how much it increases per level, but luckily I'm here to help. The first stealth check that you make is a DC 15 stealth check, which is relatively difficult, but passable for most characters, even without like stealth expertise or anything like that. And then the next one is DC 17, and then after that it goes up by 1. So it's 15, 17, 18, 19, 20. Why they skip 16, I couldn't tell you, but that's just how they decided that it should work. While you're invisible, of course, you have advantage on all your attack rolls, and enemies won't target you, and even if they do target you, they have disadvantage on attacks against you. So you can use this to, as long as you continue to make the stealth checks, infinitely cast spells or make attacks without starting a combat. Enemies just won't be able to interact with you at all as long as you can continue to make the increasingly difficult stealth checks. Obviously, this is insanely powerful if you have a build based around it and based around making the stealth checks. In particular, this combos extremely well with the spell Pass Without Trace, which gives you just a flat +10 bonus to all of your stealth checks, meaning that you only even if you had no stealth bonus, which is unlikely, you would only need to roll a 5 in order to pass the first stealth check. But of course, you're going to have some stealth bonus, and presumably you'll have advantage from some sort of effect that you can add. You're going to do your best to maximize your stealth checks if you're building around greater invisibility. For a build based around greater invisibility, it's broken, because the enemies will just sit there and let you attack them forever. Since this is a video game, the enemies just really have no defenses against an invisible attacker continuing to attack them. Obviously, in a tabletop game, people wouldn't just sit there and take arrow after arrow. They would try to do something about it, but in a video game, they don't, which makes it extremely powerful in that context. But even outside the context of a build based around greater invisibility, it's still pretty good. This is a great way to steal stuff, to get past certain encounters in the game where you have to like stealth past a guard or something. It's a great way to break out of jail if that is something that matters to you. And there's a lot of encounters in the game where greater invisibility is just your best bet for getting through an area without triggering a combat, even aside from its use as a combat spell. It also is, the save DC is low enough that you should be able, on many characters, even not built for greater invisibility, to use this spell just as a normal combat spell. And so I recommend taking this spell anyways, even if you aren't building around the cheesy game-breaking strategy built around it. Obviously, if you're building a party around, or a character around Pass Without Trace, plus greater invisibility, plus like arrow attacks for a sword bard or something, this is probably the easiest way to solo the game, incidentally. If you want to solo Tactician or Honor mode, the greater invisibility, Pass Without Trace Sword Bard is probably the single easiest character, and you can see a lot of videos on YouTube of people doing that. But even outside of that context where you're using it to kind of break the game because the AI doesn't react to being shot, you can benefit pretty strongly from this just as a normal spell. I'm going to rate it A tier because I think it is an A tier spell outside of its game-breaking context, but of course if you're building around it, then you have to take it higher. But considered as a spell that you are just choosing to prepare and cast normally, I think it's still a very good spell. Guardian of Faith. Guardian of Faith is another pseudo-summon spell, but does not require your concentration, unlike Grasping Vine. It lasts for 10 turns and creates a Divine Guardian, which is a large-sized creature that, when an enemy enters the area that it covers or attacks it, it makes an attack against that enemy as a reaction. That attack is actually not an attack, it's a dexterity saving throw, and it does 20 radiant damage with the dex save for half. So it claims it's an attack, but it's actually a dex save. However, when it does that, it also does 20 radiant damage to itself. It has 60 HP and 20 AC, which is pretty good stats for a summon, but of course it's going to damage itself every time it attacks, meaning it's not going to last that long as a summon. If you consider this just as a pure damage spell, right, it gets to attack 3 times, doing 20 radiant damage to an enemy and 20 to itself each time before it blows up, it will do 60 radiant damage with a dex save for half. 60 damage with a dex save for half for a level 4 spell is a pretty darn good ratio. Compare this to Blight, right, which is 8d8 of damage for an average of 36 with a con save for half. Guardian of Faith is doing almost double the damage of Blight on average, and while you don't get to control which enemy it attacks as easily, the amount of damage that you're getting is significant. But the benefits of this spell don't stop just with the baseline damage, which is already quite good. For one thing, enemies can attack it, and it has 20 AC and 60 HP, and unless they do 20 or more damage to it with their attacks, they're not reducing the amount of damage you're getting out of this spell. And of course, if it's absorbing more than 20 damage, then as a summon it's already done a big chunk of its job. With 20 AC, enemies who attack it are also very likely to miss it pretty frequently. So, by itself, it's a great way to distract enemies, as well as a very efficient way to deal damage. But the hits don't stop coming. Guardian of Faith also has the hidden passive, huge. It's just a really big creature, meaning that it's going to fill almost every doorway in the game completely, blocking that doorway entirely because it blocks enemy movement. This is a great way to seal off doorways and stop enemies from getting through them, forcing them to engage with the Guardian of Faith, where they're going to miss a bunch of attacks because it's got 20 AC, and where it's going to continuously hit them because of how Guardian of Faith works. Finally, in addition to all of those advantages, there's actually ways to get more than 60 damage out of this thing by healing it or protecting it from damage. While it is immune to most healing in the game because it's a construct, so you can't target it with Healing Word, it doesn't care about potions or anything like that. You can target it with Aid, which will affect undead and constructs, boosting its maximum health and healing it, allowing it to make more attacks in a round. Even 5 points of healing will get it from a level 2 Aid spell, will get it to make a 4th attack, bringing its damage from 60 to 80. And so not only have you cast Aid on your whole party, you've also gotten 20 damage out of a cast of an already excellent spell. You can also target it with Warding Bond, halving incoming damage and halving the damage that it does to itself, getting its damage output from 60 to 120. Combining these two effects together, you can get its average damage up to 140 or 160, depending on the level of aid that you cast on it, meaning that it's one of the most efficient spell slots to damage effects in the game, as long as you can get enemies to stay near it and keep attacking it. Since it's so giant, even though it can't move, enemies will often be stuck near it because you can trap them in with its enormous butt, forcing them to engage with the Divine Guardian. Of course, it also benefits very well from wall spells like Wall of Fire or whatever, but in general, it will not be hard to arrange the arena so that enemies will have to stay near the Guardian of Faith. Even without those tricks like Aid or Warding Bond, you gain a very solid summon and good damage from this spell. With those tricks, this spell goes to significantly better, and anything that can block up enemy movement and distract enemy attacks and stuff is always worth looking at. Would I say this is an S tier spell? I think probably not, because there are a lot of fights where it will not be possible to arrange it so that you get maximum value out of this spell, but this is just a great spell that you're going to use to devastating effect very often, and I will put it in A tier. I think that this is another one of the very underrated spells in the game, because people see that it can't move, and they see that it kills itself as it does damage, and they think they're not getting a ton of value out of it. But even at the worst, like in the worst case scenario, you're maybe blocking one attack and doing 40 damage, and that's a great use of a level 4 spell. So, and of course you can get way better than the worst case scenario depending on how this spell plays out. So, excellent spell, highly recommended. Keep an eye out in many arenas for areas, choke points, and bottlenecks that you can use for Guardian of Faith, and also just put it next to enemies and they'll attack it pretty frequently. Ice Storm. Ice Storm is a single cast, so it's not like concentration or anything. You just cast it and it does the damage. 60-foot range, 20-foot radius AoE spell that does 2d8 bludgeoning damage and 4d6 of cold damage and creates an ice surface that lasts for 2 turns. 2d8 plus 4d6 is an average of 9 plus 14, 23 damage, so a pretty sad amount of damage, honestly, for a level 4 spell slot, but it is in an AoE, and of course, like all other cold damage, it can be doubled against wet enemies, so it's not quite as bad as it sounds in terms of damage, but still not a great damage spell. As an ice surface creator, though, it's pretty good, because it's a 20-foot radius ice surface, which is very large. So the question is basically, is this ever worth casting over Sleet Storm, which is the gold standard way to create a gigantic ice surface? The answer is yes, because this is not concentration, and it does a little bit of damage, so you can be concentrating on something else and create a gigantic ice surface, knock everyone over, while doing some marginal damage to the enemies. The damage component of this spell is not amazing, but the crowd control component of this spell is very good. The fact that it doesn't require your concentration for such a large ice surface makes it pretty good. The fact that you can get some more damage out of it with additional cold damage is pretty nice. It's dex save for half, but even so, the amount of damage that you're getting out of this, I would say, is not often going to be relevant, but sometimes it's a nice way to finish off low health enemies. But primarily you're using this just to create a big ice surface without spending your concentration, and ice surfaces are so good in this game that even if that's all you're doing with a level 4 spell slot, it's still good. It's basically like a big grease. It's grease with some extra damage, and grease with some extra damage is pretty reasonable in this game, especially because the surface lasts for a reasonable length of time. I would say this is a B tier spell. Often you're going to be better off just using Grease if you want the CC. Often you're going to be better off using Sleet Storm if you want a big ice surface. But as a spell that just knocks some enemies over, and does some damage, I think this is a totally reasonable spell to prepare and cast most adventuring days. It is also on like druids and clerics who will often want to be concentrating on something else and not have the use of Sleet Storm. So just the fact that it doesn't take your concentration and knocks a bunch of enemies over, pretty reasonable spell, I would say. B tier spell. I think this spell is generally slightly overrated by the community because people love damage, but the amount of damage it does is just not that relevant, but the ice surface is great. Otiluke's Resilient Sphere. So this is a spell that has an extremely misleading tooltip, which gets more common as we get into the higher level spell slots, but I'm here to help, so I will tell you how the spell actually works as opposed to how the description claims that it works. So Resilient Sphere is a 3-turn duration control effect that requires your concentration, dexterity save to negate when cast on an enemy. It will enclose the creature in a ball of force, which is often called the hamster ball, and while inside the ball, things outside of the sphere cannot draw line of sight to that creature, and that creature can't draw line of sight to things outside of it. So targeted spells and effects can't target something that's inside the hamster ball, and it won't be able to target effects outside the hamster ball. What it doesn't do is stop it from, and also any damage that it would take from like a ground targeting effect or something like that won't affect the creature when it's inside. So if it walks over a spike growth while in the hamster ball, it won't take any damage from the spikes. If it walks through a wall of fire while in the hamster ball, it won't take any fire damage. However, ground targeting effects that aren't damage can still affect the creature that's in the ball. So if you have a grease underneath a creature in Resilient Sphere, or if they try to path over an ice surface, they'll still fall over. And they can still self-buff. They can also still cast ground-targeting AoE effects at their feet. As long as they target directly at their own feet, those effects will still affect things outside of the sphere. So if you are in a sphere and you cast Spike Growth at your own feet, then the Spike Growth will extend outside the sphere and affect creatures in the radius of the spell around you. This spell also has a secret bonus where it's 100% effective against creatures in your party, so you can cast it on your party members and they won't have to roll a dexterity save, and they won't roll a dexterity save against it. They'll just always go in the hamster ball. But that doesn't work on allied NPCs, which is who you'd really want to protect from damage using this effect, and so that definitely holds the spell back. This is a different effect from Tabletop, incidentally, where any creature can just always choose to fail a save against an effect. And so if you try to put an ally in a hamster ball, they'll probably choose to fail the save, and you can guaranteed keep them safe for the duration of a combat using this spell, which is one of the best uses for a spell, is to protect a vulnerable NPC from damage during a combat. In Baldur's Gate, that doesn't work doesn't work consistently because the allies will always roll a dex save against the Resilient Sphere effect. So if you're trying to protect, like Jaheira in Moonrise Towers, she will roll a dex save against it, and if she succeeds, then you've wasted a spell for nothing and haven't kept her alive during this combat. When used against an enemy, Resilient Sphere is basically a slightly worse banish, because while it effectively removes an enemy from combat for 3 turns in exchange for your concentration, the same as Banish, there are 2 downsides compared to Banish. One is that you can the enemies can still act while they're in the sphere, so they can still heal, drink potions, buff themselves. They can even cast AoE spells at their feet, although the AI will usually avoid doing this, so I don't think that's a huge concern. But the fact that they can heal and buff themselves and stuff while they're in the sphere does make this a less hard to disable than Balance. And also, it's a dexterity save rather than a charisma save, so it's less likely to take effect, because enemies will typically have better dex saves than they will charisma saves. Of course, some enemies will have weak dex saves, but often those enemies will be huge or larger in size, and so you won't be able to use the Resilient Sphere against them either. Now, this spell is modal because it can be used to remove an ally from combat for 3 turns, protecting them completely. So if you need to protect an ally who's in a bad situation, or if you're about to do something silly like set off a gigantic bomb of fireworks or explosive barrels or something, Resilient Sphere, it gives you perfect protection from those effects. So you can use Resilient Sphere to like blow up the whole fireworks factory in Act 3 and survive with no problems. Things like that are totally doable when in Resilient Sphere. So it does have a small modal benefit to it, but overall it's Banish, but very slightly worse. And Banish, I think, is already kind of on the lower edge of A tier, so I think I'm going to put Resilient Sphere in B tier, just because it targets a worse saving throw and isn't a complete disable. And the uses on allies are fun, but since allies will roll dexterity saves against it, it just doesn't have as high an impact as you would want from a spell that can save your allies. So I wouldn't recommend this spell over Banishment if that's a choice that you're making. It can still be a useful spell, and it's good for removing a boss from a fight and then clearing up all the adds, and it can save an ally who's in a really bad situation, so definitely one that's worth preparing overall, but I think slightly worse than Banishment on balance. Phantasmal Killer. Phantasmal Killer is interesting in Baldur's Gate because a lot of crowd control spells that spells that remove enemies from combat have had their duration reduced from 10 turns to 2 or 3 turns compared to their tabletop versions. Phantasmal Killer is still a 10-turn duration fear. It's a wisdom saving throw concentration effect that causes an enemy to become feared, so unable to move, and disadvantage on attack rolls and skill checks. And they take 4d10 psychic damage every turn. Now, they get a wisdom save every single turn to break out of this effect, and so they, like a lot of these spells, there are 2 saving throws before you do any damage to them, because they get a saving throw against the initial cast, and then they get a saving throw before it will actually do the damage. And so they have to fail 2 wisdom saves in order to actually lose their movement or actually take damage. And the amount of damage that it does is not very high, and the frightened effect on a single creature at this level, a lot of enemies are immune to fear. If you're looking for a disabling spell, the ones that allow them to make multiple saves against the effects are just always going to be much weaker than the ones that allow that require only a single save before they take effect. The medium extra damage on this spell, so it's going to average 22 damage per turn if they continuously fail the wisdom save, which is fine. That's a totally reasonable additional damage, but for a single target disable that doesn't actually stop them from acting, it just stops them from moving, I don't recommend this spell particularly. It's too situational, too unreliable, because enemies can make the saves, and a lot of enemies are straight up immune to the effect, especially more dangerous enemies. Psychic damage is also one of the worst damage types in the game, because lots and lots of enemies are immune to it, although many of the enemies that are immune to it just won't be targetable by this spell in the first place, because if they're immune to psychic damage, it's pretty likely they're also immune to fear. Overall, the damage on this spell is not good enough to justify using this concentration spell over a much easier to land and more powerful concentration disable like Hold Person, that many fewer enemies are immune to, or ones that don't require multiple saving throws like Banishment, Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, and so on. D-tier spell just because it's competing against so many better options. Polymorph. They seem to have the wrong image for Polymorph here. I'm not sure exactly why, so let's fix that one. We are once again doing some live HTML, which I know is everyone's favorite thing here. So let me grab the image and fix the image for Polymorph. I think this is the image for one of the Smite spells. Not sure why it's the wrong one. Anyways, here we go. It's Polymorph. Polymorph is a 5-turn concentration spell that turns the enemy into a harmless sheep. The sheep has 3 hit points, and if it takes 3 points of damage and gets its hit points reduced to 0, then they will revert to the original form with the hit points that they had before they got polymorphed. A 5-turn concentration disable is pretty good, and you can set up non-targeting, non-damaging disables to stack on this. So you can stack like grease under them, ice surfaces under them. So even when you start hitting them, they will come back CC'd and stuff. And unlike some of the spells, I have seen enemies target each other to break each other out of the polymorph, but in my experience, it seems much less common than waking each other from sleep. So the AI, I think, may be programmed to do this less often. That's totally anecdotal. I have no significant evidence that that is how it works. It's a wisdom save that is only a single save to remove an enemy from combat for 5 turns, provided they aren't taking 3 damage. But because the enemy's allies can deal damage to them pretty easily, this is a less powerful way to remove an enemy from combat for multiple turns. If the AI targets the sheep, then you have basically spent a level 4 spell slot for nothing. But of course, if they don't target the sheep, then you get to remove a powerful enemy for 5 turns, and a 5-turn long disable is pretty good. I would say this is most useful against enemies who are alone or are far away from their allies, so they can't easily be targeted by allies and have the polymorph broken off of them. And in general, I think that the way that this spell is pretty unreliable and will have enemies break each other out, even if it doesn't happen as often as waking from hypnotic pattern or sleep, is still going to hold this spell back significantly. And because it only targets a single enemy, you can't just, hypnotic pattern, they can break each other out of the effect, but you can hit the whole encounter with it, so you're pretty likely to just disable the whole encounter or force several enemies to waste their turns breaking each other out. Here, it's going to cost an enemy 1 turn to break the target out, and usually if you're targeting a boss with a disable spell, you want it to last for longer than 1 turn, and since it often won't cost the boss an action, but instead costs one of their adds or minions in action, it is going to be significantly less powerful than other disable spells. In general, I think this spell is superseded by spells like Resilient Sphere or Banish because it has the same effect, but this one is much less reliable because any damage that they take will break them out of it. Even absent an ally, they can still run over a fire surface or just get caught in a stray AoE and get broken out of it. I think this spell does have some use against lone enemies, but it's not one that I would recommend using too frequently, because the AI in Baldur's Gate does help their allies get out of these types of effects. It is I would say, a C-tier spell because you need to cast it in a position where it's going to actually cost the enemies multiple turns worth of actions, and that is relatively unlikely in my experience. Stoneskin. Stoneskin is a long rest duration concentration spell, so you can't, because it's concentration, you can't get this from a camp follower, but it will last all day, and it gives you resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. Resistance is a very powerful effect that's quite hard to get, and resistance to physical damage is extremely strong, but this is a level 4 spell, and that means that you are at minimum level 7 by the time you're getting it on your druid, or whatever, and at that point in the game, how many enemies do you face who don't have magical attacks? The answer is very, very few. If you know you are going into a fight where the enemy specifically does not have magical weapons, you could use Stoneskin, and in that case it's going to be pretty powerful, but it has to be an enemy that does physical damage and doesn't have a magic weapon of any kind, because that will break through the Stoneskin resistance completely, and that is just such a rare thing to encounter by the time you reach the level that you get this spell at, that this spell just does not have that much use. The fact that it takes your concentration is also pretty poor for this spell, because it you often will not want to self-cast it, since this spell is supposed to be used on a character that takes lots of hits, right? You're trying to reduce incoming damage when you cast this spell. Any concentration spell that you're intended to self-cast that's defensive has the inherent anti-synergistic problem of you are intending to take hits with that character, which is going to force you to make concentration checks in order to maintain concentration on this spell, which you spent a level 4 spell slot on, so losing concentration is pretty painful. The fact that it lasts all day does give it some value, because you can precast it, it doesn't take an action, but the likelihood of actually getting any damage resistance out of this spell by the time you finally get access to this spell is extremely low. So I wouldn't recommend Stoneskin in general. Certainly not something to cast at the beginning of an adventuring day, because you're spending a level 4 spell slot on something that mostly won't come up. Maybe there's a couple specific encounters that you could prepare it for, but I can't really think of any. If there's any that you have ideas where this could be good in the comments, then, let me know for specific encounters. I think in general, as a rule of thumb, you're better off not using this spell, and even for the specific encounters where it might be good, it's just not that powerful in effect. So I wouldn't recommend Stoneskin. It's a purely defensive spell that's extremely situational and will come up almost never in Baldur's Gate. And in general, that's true just in Dungeons & Dragons overall. By the time you're level 7, most enemies are going to have some form of magical attack that's going to bypass the Stoneskin effect. D-tier spell, so I don't recommend casting that. Wall of Fire. Wall of Fire is a concentration-based ground targeting effect that creates a wall of flames in a line, and that line can be up to 120 feet long if you can draw a continuous line for 120 feet. Also worth noting that because it has a maximum range of 60 feet, the only way you can get that 120-foot line is if you draw it over yourself, because you would have to be at the exact center of the circle in order to do that. So chances are you will not be drawing a 120-foot wall of fire, since that would put yourself directly inside of it. It's also worth noting that the targeting on this spell is extremely janky. The game is very unfriendly to the player in terms of what can actually be drawn as a wall. Tiny differences in height, something like a curtain or a tiny pillar that you'd think a wall of fire could go straight through will interrupt the targeting of the spell. And so the likelihood that you're getting more than a 20-foot or 30-foot line of wall of fire is fairly low. But when it's on the ground, anything that's in it when you cast the spell immediately takes 5d8 fire damage with a dex save for half, and then every turn that they end their turn in the spell, they take that damage again. Now, because Baldur's Gate uses completely different timing rules for every single spell for reasons that remain inexplicable to me, Wall of Fire damage happens at the end of the character's turn, so you don't, unlike some other ground targeting spells, get to double dip on the damage, something like a Moonbeam or whatever that lets you double dip on the damage. Wall of Fire doesn't do that, because unless they end their turn in the spell, they won't take the damage a second time. So you get the initial damage when you cast it, and then they have to end their turn inside Wall of Fire in order to get the damage a second time. 5d8 of damage with a dex save for half is not a lot, although this also creates a burning effect on the ground that will light enemies on fire, causing them to take an additional 1d4 damage at the beginning of every turn. So it's actually 5d8 plus 1d4, but still not a ton of damage. However, I still like this spell a lot, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is that it messes with the AI a lot, because they will go way out of their way to avoid standing in the fire damage, and which, unlike some other effects that mess with the AI, I don't think is exploitative, because it seems pretty reasonable to me that most people would not want to stand in a giant wall of fire, even if it was the tactically optimal decision. So if I was a DM, I would probably rule that most enemies are going to try to avoid the gigantic wall of burning flames, right? And there are several encounters in the game where your enemies are being funneled through a narrow location, and Wall of Fire will just completely solve the encounter all by itself. In particular, the Shadow Portal defense in Act 2, I think, is an encounter where Wall of Fire solos the encounter completely, but there's several others where it's lots of low-health enemies that are moving towards you, and keeping them in the Wall of Fire is extremely powerful. You can also combo this with effects that trap enemies in place, like Spike Growth, which I incorrectly said was flammable, but it's actually not flammable, so you can put Spike Growth under Wall of Fire. and force enemies to stay within the wall, guaranteeing that you get the additional damage. Anything that holds enemies in place combos extremely well with Wall of Fire for a lot of extra damage, and of course it combos extremely well with effects that knock enemies prone, fear them, and so on, because it will stop them from leaving the Wall of Fire. It doesn't combo so well with ice surfaces, as you might imagine, because it's a gigantic Wall of Fire, so it's going to melt them, but other effects that can stop enemies from moving, Wall of Fire is extremely strong with. Another advantage to Wall of Fire is that it does the 1d4 and the 5d8 damage separately, so that's 2 different damage instances. So it's actually a pretty solid way to remove Unstoppable from bosses, just because the burning damage will continuously tick, so every turn they're going to lose, even if they leave the Wall of Fire. Setting them on fire will do 1d4 damage every turn, which will continuously tick off their Unstoppable charges, giving you some additional ways to burn through those. That's not a huge component of the spell, but it is a nice little advantage that the spell has. Obviously, there's other ways to light enemies on fire, but this is still a pretty good one. And just because this spell solos so many encounters and is, generally speaking, I would say a pretty good way to just do damage, it's a great thing to concentrate on if you have nothing else to do. It's also, because of the long range and the kind of way that it works, a good way to target anything that is immobile, so like the Shadow Rifts in Act 2, or the things that the shadow enemies come out of in the Shar Temple. It's a good way to get rid of those. It's a good way to deal with the supporting enemies in a bunch of the boss fights that are immobile. It's not a great way to destroy a lot of objects, because a lot of objects do resist fire damage, but it's still overall a generally excellent spell for clearing large groups of enemies, manipulating the AI, doing solid damage. Just a good concentration spell, even aside from the fact that it fully solos several otherwise quite difficult encounters in the game. I'm going to say this is an A-tier spell. I think it is powerful enough that you are justified in taking it on just about every adventuring day, and you're going to use it pretty often. While it isn't the most powerful damaging effect, it's extremely consistent, and even despite the targeting issues that the spell does have because of how the game handles drawing walls, it's still just a very reliable spell overall, and one that I highly recommend. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the level 4 spells. So, summing this all up, you can see that we have really started to move the spells down the list. Honestly, there's a few more spells at A and B tier than I was expecting from level 4, because level 4 really struggles in terms of design space. This is actually something I maybe want to do another video on at some point, is the design challenges inherent in making level 4 spells, because level 3 spells really change the game, and then level 5 spells sort of change the way that your characters interact with the world. Level 4 spells are kind of stuck in this in-between state where they just really need to have good numbers in order to be efficient, and a lot of them just don't have good enough numbers. So this is, I would say, a pretty solid showing from the level 4 spells, slightly better than I was expecting, honestly. There's only one spell I think is absolutely critical at level 4, and a lot of the time you're going to be better off upcasting level 3 spells, but you can get some really strong benefits from the A and B tier spells, and of course the C tier spells do show up sometimes. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, let me know what you think should be moved around. I will frequently make changes as a result of the comments that I get. One of the best things about doing this is that I have learned a lot from you guys, and the other great thing about doing this is that it's really made me look at some of the less useful or less frequently used spells in the game in new ways, and has kind of inspired me to do other builds and stuff. I've got a couple that I'm thinking of even just from looking at these spells. And, of course, if you take a moment to leave a comment and like the video, it helps a ton with the algorithm, just spreading these videos to other people, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.